The Federal Reserve. Some people think that it was created by a conspiracy of nefarious bankers. Other people think those people are tinfoil hat wearing jerks. What's the deal with the Federal Reserve?
It's the Alien Conspiracy Podcast. We are your hosts, Agent ETA and
Agent Anderson. Come along as we examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. Follow the show on Twitter at AlienConPod. All right, this week's episode is The Conspiracy to Create the Federal Reserve. And there's no Mind Boggle of the Week this week. The episode is the Mind Boggle. In fact, there's probably a good 100, 200, 500, whatever. There's a lot of them in here.
there's a whole heap.
This is an episode of Mind Boggles. So I thought we'd start off with a little prequel here, a little appetizer of Andrew Jackson versus the central bank.
Yes. There's a long history throughout our country of a fight against a centralized bank. One of the great characters within our history is Andrew Jackson. I think he's probably the president that has done the most as far as working against like a centralized bank within this country. Obviously, it didn't take hold for forever, but he did a lot of good, I think.
Yeah, so he was fighting the second central bank that our country had.
Yes.
And that bank was chartered in 1817 and liquidated in 1841. The structure of that bank was that the U.S. government held 20% of the bank's shares. The other 80% of the bank's shares was held by approximately 4,000 investors, 1,000 of which were supposedly from Europe. But we're not too sure about that number because the list of the investors was not public. It was secret. So we have no idea who actually owned the Central Bank of America at that time. Oh yeah, go ahead, Agent ETA.
Oh, well, I was going to say, another huge thing that Andrew Jackson actually did, and he is the only president to have done this, is he actually paid off the entirety of the national debt.
So I was going to talk a little bit about the largest investors of this bank actually purchased their shares with loans from the bank that they were creating. Mm-hmm. So they basically got their ownership for free.
Pull the old bait and switch technique.
Yeah, so the U.S. government put up a ton of money. The quote-unquote private investors actually didn't put up that much money at all.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they're using the old tactic, always invest with somebody else's money, right?
Yeah. So you think a central bank, that's a government thing, right? That's government-owned, government-controlled, or whatever. But this particular central bank that Andrew Jackson was combating was actually a private for-profit company, and it was not a government institution at all. Just to kind of highlight that, the bank's president said at one time, "No officer of the government, from the president downwards, has the least right, the least authority to meddle in the concerns of the bank." So he pretty much just said it. Exactly what I was hinting at there was that it was not a government entity and they didn't want anything to do with the government, even though you might think that the Central Bank of the United States would be a government thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it also displays some of their arrogance as well. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout some of these statements that you'll hear from some of these bankers. And when they get any kind of pushback, there's been some issues throughout our history. I personally think now some of these issues that I speak of, what I'm referring to is like assassination attempts and stuff like that. I think there's been some of those incidents that were closely tied to what a president or a politician has said in direct reference to the bank.
So in 1832, I guess, is when this particular story really begins. The bank passed a renewal to its 20-year charter. So every 20 years, it had to renew its government charter to continue operations. Mm-hmm. In 1832, now remember, it started in 1817. So in 1832, the charter was not up yet, but it tried to pass one earlier anyways, just to kind of get ahead of the game.
Yeah, and from what I understand, the reason why they're trying to push this through early is because Andrew Jackson was coming up for re-election, and they wanted to create controversy. They didn't think that Andrew Jackson would veto this bill. They didn't think that he would want that kind of controversy going into elections, into a campaign. So they figured they were going to call his bluff, basically,
Yeah, and it does take a lot of cojones to veto a bill, especially backed by such powerful entities as this one. Mm-hmm. So it passed Congress in 1832, and it was vetoed by Jackson. So I guess he did have some cojones after all. This, like you were saying, this made the bank was the central issue of the 1832 election.
Yes.
Now, here's an interesting little factoid. So if this is, supposedly a neutral government institution, then why did the bankers fund Jackson's political opponents? Ask yourself that question. So the central bank, or the people behind the central bank, were funding the campaigns of Jackson's political opponents. Now, I'm saying that again because you have to wrap your head around that fact that these are not neutral parties.
Oh, no.
They are very much involved in the political process, and they try to manipulate the process.
Yes.
But Jackson won the election by a wide margin.
And I think it's important to note also, supposedly from what I read, Jackson actually went on the first kind of like in-person campaign tour that a president had ever done. Before that, the presidents had kind of like stayed, home or stayed in the Capitol and ran their campaign from there, and had, the word spread out through papers and stuff like that. But Jackson actually took the effort to go around the nation and talk to people personally, give personal speeches, and get out to the voters himself. And that hadn't been done before. That made a big impression on the public,
So in 1833, after he was elected, Jackson feared that the central banks would, in a fit of revenge, would try and cause some sort of financial hardship for the people of America. So he removed all government deposits and he put them in regional and state banks instead. And like you're saying, he kind of paid off all this debt and stuff. So guess what happened? The bank retaliated and they caused a recession, just as Jackson had feared.
Well, I actually think that there's a kind of an interesting series of events that happened leading up to that. So when Jackson first told his first Secretary of Treasury, Lewis McLean, to start removing the government's deposits from the second bank, he refused. So he fired him. So he appointed another fella, William J. Duane. Duane also refused, so Jackson fired him. So he went on to another individual. The last individual that he appointed was Roger B. Taney, and Taney actually complied with his order and started withdrawing government funds, I believe, on October 1st of 1833.
Now, imagine the arrogance of telling your boss, let's say you work at a restaurant and your boss says, okay, well, that table over there, take the dishes off so we can put new people at that table. And you just tell your boss, nah, I'm not going to do it.
No, I'd rather not.
That's kind of an it's really hard to wrap your head around some of this stuff.
Well, but Old Hickory, he had his foot down and he planned on keeping it down, so he stuck to his guns and he fired the guys until he got the right guy in, I suppose.
Well, that's what would happen if you were working at a normal job. If you don't do your job, you get fired.
Yeah, ain't nothing wrong with that.
So the bank, I don't want to go into too much detail because this very easily could be a whole series of episodes on itself.
Oh, yeah.
But to summarize this period of time, during the early 1830s, the bank engaged in a lot of shenanigans and tomfoolery, like currency manipulation, and fraud, and just a lot of really basically illegal stuff. And it lost popular support. Yes,
it did. Well, and also the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, he was one of those very arrogant type of individuals that had made public statements threatening to cause a depression, for example, if the bank was not rechartered.
But it was not rechartered because of all the shenanigans. It lost popular support and it was not renewed. That would have been in 1836 that they would have had to renew it, and it was liquidated by 1841. I guess it took a few years to wind it down. And guess what happened to the economy after the bank was gone?
Well, from what I understand, it flourished.
Nothing. The economy was just fine. The economy did what it does. It was great. Times were good.
Well, it stabilized.
I mean, I guess it wasn't perfect, but it's not like there was some sort of economic collapse when the bank went away, the central bank.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't the big situation that they claimed it was. They said the bankers said that the nation was going to collapse. Everybody's going to lose their jobs. Industry was going to collapse and everything, but that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, so when I was researching this, there's an interesting little factoid I found. In the 1820s, apparently the bank caused a collapse in the price of goods by contracting credit, basically by calling back loans.
And
this
then
caused
refusing to give out more loans, right?
Yeah, this caused a depression in the United States. Now, I said 1820s. You might be thinking of the 1929 depression, which this is not that. But at first, I was looking at my notes here, and I'm thinking, wait, did I say that wrong? 1890? No, it's 1820s. And it's, almost 100 years apart from the 1920s. Just a coincidence, I guess. Nothing more, just a coincidence.
Well, these things have happened throughout our history.
Jackson described the bank as a hydra of corruptions and dangerous to our liberties. So that ended America's second central bank until the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. So we had this glorious period of a 60, 70 years, give or take, without a central bank. And that's where our story really begins. Well, really, it begins in 1910. Do you want to kick us off there?
There was a very important meeting in 1910. This meeting was on a place called Jekyll Island. It was a resort there, and the resort was owned by J.P. Morgan. A lot of people, J.P. Morgan wasn't there at this meeting, but some very, very big financial leaders were there. And the first and most prominent person probably was Nelson W. Aldrich. Obviously, Aldrich was an American politician, leader of the Republican Party in the United States Senate. Aldrich had tried to pass through a bill that was very similar, almost exact to the Federal Reserve Act, called the Aldrich Bill, I believe. Was that what it's called? Aldrich Bill?
I think it was the Aldrich Plan. Should we just, before we go to the actual plot, should we just mention who was there and who they were connected to, I guess?
Okay, yeah. All right.
I'll start with Senator. He was a senator, so Nelson Aldrich, because, oh boy howdy, is he my favorite. He's my hero of all time. No, not really. Anyways, so he was a business associate of, guess who? J.P. Morgan. That name's going to come up a lot in this one. He was the father-in-law to J.D. Rockefeller Jr. You don't say. That can't be a coincidence. He was a leader of the Republican Party, as you've already said. He was a senator from 1881 to 1911, and he was a chair of the Senate Finance Committee. And that they do like banks and monetary policy and that kind of stuff. He was called the general manager of the nation because he had such heavy control over the monetary policy of the nation. I was reading a book about the Federal Reserve that was very much pro-Federal Reserve. And it was interesting because it said, oh yeah, that Jekyll Island conspiracy totally happened, but they only did that because it was for the good of the nation. It was America. They wanted to make America great.
Of course.
That's why they did this. So I just wanted to illustrate that the people involved here, they're not nice people. These are not people who were interested in the good of anything other than themselves. And to illustrate that point, Senator Aldrich, whatever.
Yeah.
King Leopold II of Belgium had a private company that took over the Congo area. They enslaved the population. They used mercenaries to take over everybody and force them to work in mines for harvesting rubber, for ivory, and various things like that. Now, if these people, if they basically were slaves, they weren't paid anything, if they missed quotas, then the mercenaries would cut off the hands of men, women, and children. This is one of the worst times in human history. This regime was known for murder, for atrocities, for torture, for systematic brutality. Historians estimate that between 1 and 15 million people died as a result of this. And the consensus seems to be about 10 million people. So wrap your head around that.
Oh, wow, man.
A private company goes into the Congo, enslaves them, and kills maybe 10 million, maybe only a million. Hey, let's be generous here. Maybe it was only 5 million. Anyways, millions of people.
I got to tell you, I was not aware that those numbers were so drastic. I had heard about this event or this situation you're talking about, but wow, that's an incredible number right there.
It was hell on earth, and it's surprising that we don't know more about it today. We know about certain atrocities, but not others, and I don't understand why that is, but this one was really bad. And I bring this up because guess who? Senator Aldrich was an investor of this company. He was an investor and supporter of this company, just to kind of demonstrate what kind of a person he was. And that's just to kind of counteract this idea that, oh, they were just doing it for the good of the country. They cared about the prosperity of America. No, they didn't care about anything except for themselves. Because if they did, there's no way they could support a company like this.
Yeah, if you're supporting something like that, then morals aren't exactly high on your list of to-dos, you know?
So I won't go into that much detail on all the other guys, but I really wanted to talk about him in detail just to kind of flesh out the type of persons that we're dealing with here.
So he's an important one. He kind of stands out above the, most of them,
Yeah, he was probably the main ringleader of the whole event. So the next one I have on my list here is Abraham P. Andrew. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He was friendly with the bankers. He was a Republican, and he was an ally of Senator Aldrich. He was a bank director for 29 years before being appointed to the assistant secretary position. Now, my guess is that if they sent the high-profile guys like the secretary of the Treasury, people might pay attention to that. So they send their assistants. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, but there's one other accolade that you forgot to mention about Mr. Andrew there.
Oh, and what might that be?
Well, he wasn't such a bad guy, right? He was actually the founder and director of the American Ambulance Field Service during World War I.
Oh, yeah, I read about that's right. I did read about that. Yeah.
And speaking of how you mentioned earlier, how some texts like are pro Federal Reserve and pro describing these people as being, patriots, what have you. I just kind of find it funny because, if that person were to be revealed as being part of this nefarious meeting, say, oh, well, Mr. Andrew, though, he's a good man. See what he's done,
Right.
Kind of plausible deniability of sorts, I suppose, right?
Yeah, and one good deed doesn't necessarily make all deeds good.
That's very true. Well, yeah, I could go on a tirade there, but I was about to, but.
So next up on the list is Frank Vanderlip. He was president of the National City Bank of New York, which is now Citibank, and at the time was the single largest bank in the country. This bank had ties to Rockefeller, and this guy was the assistant secretary of the Treasury from 1897 to 1901. Another assistant secretary. Interesting.
Well, hot damn.
Do you have any more notes on Mr. Vanderlip?
Yeah, Vanderlip, I didn't have a whole lot on, to be quite honest. I didn't find a whole lot of extras on him. It seemed to be kind of dry. You got anything?
No, it's some of these people, a couple of these people sort of have disappeared into the fog of history. It's not that easy to find much on them.
They have the main notes of what they accomplished, like Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's private secretary. He was a secretary of the National Monetary Commission from 1908 to 1910. I don't have a whole lot else on that guy. I mean, I couldn't find a whole lot else on him,
Yeah. So next I have Harry Davison, who is senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. And that's all I could really find on him is that, but he's basically just worked for Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot else either. It doesn't seem like he had a whole lot of notable things that caught my eye, I guess.
Right. So next up I have Charles Norton. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was one of the biggest banks. And that bank was owned by, guess who? Drum roll, please. Any guesses? That's right. You got it in one. J.P. Morgan. That's pretty much, all I have on that guy is just that he was part of that bank. Next I have is Benjamin Strong. And he was part of the J.P. Morgan Trust Company. And guess who became the first head of the first head of the Federal Reserve? You got it, Benjamin Strong, who was at this.
None other than. With a last name like that.
So it's maybe it's just a wild coincidence that one of the people at this meeting became the first head of the Fed, but yeah, who knows? I mean, it's not like this is a show about conspiracies or anything. All right, so
never. So Paul Warburg,
War Daddy, Warbucks, Warburg.
So yeah, so
he was.
obviously,
Go ahead. You tell us about him.
Oh, we'll both tag team it. I tell you what.
Yeah.
So he was obviously an American investment banker. I believe he was born in Germany.
Yeah, I was going to say
he
wasn't an American banker. He was a partner of the Kuhn and Loeb Company, and he was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. I just want to throw this in there. I don't want to really talk about it too much, but rumor has it that he was the representative of the Rothschilds. Ooh. We have to do an episode on them sometime.
I mean, I almost feel like we need to mention them here, but once you get into that little spider web, it can lead you every which way, man. You'll have to. I mean, there's so many things you have to mention because of how much they've been supposedly involved in. I mean, yeah, it would take too long.
I tried to find out how involved they were or if they were involved with this at all, and that became a rabbit hole in and of itself real quick, and I just decided not to look into it because I just didn't have the time.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there's one direct piece of involvement that, from what I understand, the Rockefellers got one of their first very big loans from the Bank of Cleveland to start their empire. And the Bank of Cleveland was known as being like one of the few banks that was openly owned by the Rothschilds in the United States. And so the Rothschilds had been known already at that time. And keep in mind, the United States public at this period in time were pretty well informed, especially compared to nowadays, you know. So a lot of people had known that name Rothschild, and the Rothschilds were legendary for sponsoring both sides of the war, you know, in Europe and stuff like that for many years. And so they didn't. I don't think they wanted to put their name out here. They didn't want to put themselves on blast, you know. So some people have speculated that basically what they were doing was setting up the Western offshoot of their operations through the Rockefellers.
I did read a little bit about that, but I didn't really have time to research it. I definitely want to research it more at some point, though.
Mm-hmm.
Warburg was actually born in Germany to a family of bankers. He married Solomon Loeb's daughter, and that's how he became involved with the Kuhn and Loeb Company, which he was a partner of at this time in 1910. Kuhn and Loeb was a competitor of J.P. Morgan, which, that's kind of interesting.
Actually, in 1910, I'm sorry to interrupt. In 1910,
No,
I just had this in my notes. I just blurted it out. In 1910, he was elected director of Wells Fargo and Company.
Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, I actually have that. I have that in my notes. It's a little further down.
Yeah, whatever.
But so Kuhn and Loeb, you might not have heard of that. It might not sound too familiar to you, but there's a lot of family ties to the Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs and some other names you might recognize. In 1977, Kuhn and Loeb merged with Lehman Brothers, and they sort of, the name kind of dropped off, you know, the books or whatever. So if you're thinking about Lehman Brothers, that's the same company as what we're talking about now. In 1914, Paul Warburg was appointed to the board of the Federal Reserve, which, hey, you know, so that's two people here directly involved with the Federal Reserve. That's kind of interesting. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. So he was probably the most important contributor to this whole deal. He was probably the brains or the evil genius behind the whole operation.
Yeah, well, you know, it seems like there's a couple evil geniuses here behind, you know, JP Morgan,
that's true.
one of them.
Yeah.
But I think that they were all kind of following the same rule book, the same, you know, plays, you know. Same playbook is what I originally intended to say. But at any rate, I digress.
Yeah.
A lot of these, you know, these same ideals that they're working off of, it's just fractionalized reserve banking and a lot of the things that are closely related to it. You know, like for instance, if Andrew Jackson would have gotten rid of fractional reserve banking and the Second Bank of America or Second Bank of the United States, then I would argue that we may not even have the Federal Reserve right now.
Yeah, that could be a possibility.
Yeah, it would have taken way longer for them to regain their power.
But I would argue that even in Andrew Jackson's day, these banks were already so powerful that I don't think that would be possible. And certainly today, they're never going away. I think we're stuck with them for good, I think.
Well, I mean, how many countries around the world don't have centralized banks that control the government's issuance of money? Well, issues the government money at interest.
That would be 0.
No, actually, there are a couple.
Really? Okay.
One of them is North Korea.
Okay, interesting.
There's a couple. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, before we went into Libya, they didn't have a centralized bank. Before we went into Iraq, they didn't have a centralized bank, and same thing with Afghanistan as well. I'd have to look. I'm pretty sure that's true, but I could be mistaken.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about J.P. Morgan because he's sort of the guy behind all of this. And I don't want to go into too much detail about him. I just wanted to say that in 1913, the stock market was worth about 26 billion, and JP Morgan controlled about 22 billion of that market cap. So he owned almost everything of the day. Yeah. Almost everything. And that's the so-called money trust. You'll probably hear us say the money trust. We're talking about JP Morgan and all the stuff he owns. That's what we're talking about. All right. So do you want to talk about the actual event here, the conspiracy to create the Federal Reserve?
Well, how so? You want to talk about how the Federal Reserve Act was put into place, like the nefarious means in which they used to kind of sneak it by?
Well, let's start with the meeting on Jekyll Island.
Okay. So the meeting on Jekyll Island, these guys, they had put together this whole scheme of how to get there without being noticed, because every single one of these guys were very publicly recognizable faces at that time. So if people would have noticed all these people were converging onto one train cart, then somebody would have raised a red flag. Somebody would have written about it in a paper or something like that. And the gig may not have necessarily been up, but it would have at least been exposed in some way, shape, or form. So they took some precautions. They put up it was a simple story. I believe the story was that they were all going on a duck hunting trip or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I read that one person didn't even know how to use a gun, so they had to borrow a gun from somebody, and they brought it along with them.
Well, he still, he was devoted to the act that he was playing.
Yeah, and so it was supposedly some real cloak and dagger stuff. So they used some of them, not all of them. Some of them used aliases or first names. None of them used their last names. On the train car, they went on Senator Aldrich's private train car, and they all pretended to not know each other, so that any servants or whoever bringing them their lunch wouldn't realize who they were. They wore disguises. They all arrived at the train station at different times. I mean, it was all planned out, all very secretive. And
some of the most powerful people in the world at that time, and they were hiding in disguises.
Meeting in secret. And I just right away stop and ask myself, okay, well, if what they're doing is on the up and up, why do they need to hide it? If somebody's hiding something, whatever that is, probably they're up to something that's not really in the best interests of, the average person.
There's no doubt about that.
The meeting took place in November 1910. So the conspirators all gathered on this island, and they shacked up in the main cabin, which was more of a mansion, but we'll call it a cabin just, because it sounds quainter. And they banged out a plan for the Central Bank of America. Now, all of the guys there, except for Daddy Warbucks, they all wanted more of a European-style bank without a lot of government control. By Warbucks, I mean Warburg. He's the only one that wanted direct government involvement, and he wanted power restrictions on the bank. That way they could assure people that the government had control of the bank. So he was really, when I say he was the brains behind that, he knew that's what they needed to get it passed. And the idea was that they could change it over time. So they passed it eventually. We'll get to that in a little bit. He was right, because they played the long game, and the Federal Reserve Act has been amended over 100 times. So they got what they wanted, and they didn't even have to wait that long to get it. What they came up with was the Aldrich Plan, and the bank they called the Reserve Association of the United States. And they were trying very hard to make it look like a diffusion of power. And the structure was pretty much the exact thing that we have now, which regional member banks and stuff like that, to make it appear that the power isn't concentrated in one entity, but the end result is that it's, concentrated power, basically. The eventual plan was called the Aldrich Plan against the wishes of Warburg, because he knew that Aldrich was associated with the bankers and big business, and that would limit the ability of the act to pass. Like, nobody would think the Aldrich Plan was a good idea for the average person, at least. So that didn't pass. So the plan they came up with on Jekyll Island did not pass, but that was the basis for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. You might say, well, if this meeting was so secret, how do we know about it? Well, we know about it because the attendees talked about it later on in life. They kept silent about it for a long time, but we know through media interviews and diaries that these people later on in life talked about it, and they admitted that this conspiracy happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Agent ETA, would you like to tell us a little bit about the passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913?
Oh, why, certainly. So the way that they kind of pushed this act through was very unhonest, and it was sly and slick and on the low. You know what I mean? So
So wait, hold on a second. Are you trying to tell me that bankers and politicians were dishonest?
Well, maybe just a little bit at the very least. When the Federal Reserve Act was put through, first of all, let me start with this. It started with a congressional conference committee that was scheduled. It was scheduled very early in the morning, 1:30 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. on Monday, December 22nd, 1913, when most people were sleeping and stuff. I mean, this is another one of those nefarious tactics used by these people to kind of sneak things through, you know?
Yeah.
The Republican leader, Senator Bristow of Kansas, he wasn't even made aware that the committee was being held. And they had complained about it on the Senate floor afterwards. Also, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 into law afterwards. Woodrow Wilson was not a career politician. The guy was the dean of a college before he started running for any office, which was the presidency, was when he first started running for office. He was married to a Rockefeller. So, I mean, I would have to say, gee, I wonder where the money for his campaign came from. You know?
Well, that's just a coincidence. I'm sure that has no bearing on the current topic at hand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if there was benefit to it, right? But it seems that he really kind of found the error of his ways later on in life, because he himself specifically said later on in life that he doomed the country to financial failure. I think I may have mentioned that earlier, but at any rate, if I didn't, that's a very important quote, I think.
You may have mentioned it, and I may have edited it out. We'll see.
Whichever comes first. You know?
Yeah, you know.
But just the circumstances in which this bill was passed, I think is a perfect example of you know, just a sleight of hand that these people always kind of play. The bankers, the money changers, whatever you want to call them. I mean, this is the type of tactics that they use. They're not honest people. They're not there for any moralistic reason. They're there for pure profit. They're there to soak up control, soak up money, soak up everything that they can. You know, it's
well, yeah. And if you look at who got to contribute to what the Fed looked like, who got to make that decision, it was all the cronies of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller to a lesser degree. There was no public representation. There was no anybody except for this very small group of very rich people controlled the entire thing, creating this very powerful entity.
I think a very important little side note also is by this point in time, most of the media, as far as, you know, obviously it's not media that we would think of nowadays. There's no audio or video, you know, back then. It was all newspapers, but most of the newspapers in the country at that point were already owned by a lot of these bankers, either as subsidiaries or as direct, you know, entities. Yeah. So I wonder why they would do that, right? I mean, would it possibly be because they wanted to control the flow of information?
Well, I'm sure they like their pet projects, you know, kind of like how Jeff Bezos buys newspapers that are losing money just because he likes newspapers. That's it, right?
Some of the same tactics, right?
Yep. What I read when they were creating this thing, that they were trying to pass the Federal Reserve, some of the people like the bankers and Senator Aldrich actually came out publicly against it while they were privately pushing for it. They were privately lobbying for it and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, because Aldrich, like we had already stated, a lot of people already had him tied to the bankers and usurers, money changers, whatever you want to call them. So, yeah, if he would have came out with another bill that he was supporting, then obviously people would have immediately been against it.
Right.
One little quick side note, Agent Anderson, is throughout this entire time that we've been recording and discussing this event, as a matter of fact, I've been noticing some odd audio glitches. Have you been noticing that?
Definitely.
It's been consistent.
Yeah.
There's been a couple times where I've heard some like audio glitches where, I mean, I totally thought you were beginning to talk, and I had to kind of stop myself. I noticed you earlier did the same thing.
Yeah. Do you remember the last time we had a conversation? I was telling you about a song.
I'm sorry, I just did it again. Right when you said last time we were having a conversation.
I was telling you about a song by Oingo Boingo called Little Girls, and I actually read the lyrics to you because they're so incredibly creepy. And after I read those lyrics, our call got so glitchy. Like, I'm convinced that there's a system in place that looks for keywords and then starts recording your conversation when you hit certain keywords. I'm 100% convinced of this.
Well, I'll take it a step further. I think that your conversations, no matter on what digital platform or any kind of audio recording, they're always being recorded. Whether it's being tagged or not, I think may be the difference. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, so next, let's talk a little bit about what exactly is the Federal Reserve System. I think I kind of want to mention this because, first of all, let's say, is it federal? We're talking about the central bank here. This is the whole thing we've been talking about the whole time, the Federal Reserve System. Mm-hmm. Is it actually federal?
No, it is not. Does it have reserves?
No, it does not. And the third word in that phrase, or the name of the thing, system. Is it a system suggesting that it's a diffusion of power? Is it a system?
Well, I mean, it's a system. Is it set up for the benefit of the people of the United States? Not in any way, shape, or form.
No.
As far as my opinion is concerned.
Well, so the way I look at that is system suggests that it's like a system with diffused power, but it's actually not. The way, I don't want to get into the details of how it's structured, maybe not in this episode, but basically it has the appearance of diffusion of power, but in reality, the power is completely concentrated at the very top of the structure. Basically, the chair, the Federal Reserve Board, the head honchos, they can veto anything that the lesser members do at all. They have complete control of everything, basically. They named it the Federal Reserve System so that it would be popular with the people. So it would fool the people into thinking that it was a government entity and that it would provide stability to the financial system.
They don't control the business cycle. They create the business cycle.
One of the, you're glitching out again, dude.
When you said effect earlier, it made a glitch, like it was trying to understand, like, is he saying effect or affect?
So if the Fed was supposed to stabilize the economy, right? And so I looked up, okay, did that happen? What were the economic... So if you look yeah, go ahead.
I would actually like to talk about something first. Okay, so the Federal Reserve System has 12 districts, each served by an independently chartered regional reserve bank. And I think it's very important to state also is the Board of Governors, when it refers to the Federal Reserve, is made up of 7 members who are appointed to 14-year terms by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. So the President can recommend this person. It's confirmed by the Senate, and then they spend a 14-year term. That's a pretty damn long term.
14 years?
14 years. There's a lot that can freaking happen in 14 years, man.
Right.
Is there any other... I mean, I'm not aware of any other appointment, any other seat that's 14 years. Are you?
Judges are lifetime appointments.
I mean, well, I guess you're absolutely right about that. I guess that slipped my mind.
That's a whole nother thing that I'll rant on, but that's a different thing entirely, though.
Yeah. Oh, that was one of those obvious dang. Well, yeah, you're right about that.
Basically, just like the central bank that Andrew Jackson was fighting, our current Federal Reserve System, it's a privately held company that's for profit.
Yes. Well, all right. So I think one of the key historical figures who actually put it very well was actually President Garfield, who was assassinated after he had made this statement. But I digress. Anyways, he stated, and I quote, he says, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. I think that's straight to the point, and no wonder the guy got assassinated.
I don't know. He sounds a little paranoid to me.
You think so?
No, I'm just
man, he cray, huh?
One of the things they're trying to sell the Fed as a cure to economic instability. So, for example, the 1907 crash, economic hard times, whatever you want to call it, that deserves an episode on its own. But that was one of the things that convinced people that maybe we should really do this Federal Reserve thing. So let's take a look at their track record since 1913. So have they been successful at saving the economy from troubles? Well, let's see. There were economic crashes in 1921, 1929, 1962, 1987, 1989, 1990, 2000, 2007 to 2008, 2010, 2011, 2015, the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939. There were recessions from 1918 to 1919, 1920 to 1921, 1923 to 24, 1926 to 27, 1945, 1949, 1953, 1958, 1960 to 61, 1969 to 1970, 1973 to 1975, 1980, 1981 to 82, 1990 to 91, 2001, and 2007 to 2009. Yeah, I'd say they've done an excellent job of that.
Oh man, you hitting him with that hot heat as far as facts go, man. Did you guys hear that long list? What he just spouted off right there? That's a whole heap of information right there, and I was having a hard time keeping grasp on it. But
well, it's public information too. The great thing is anybody can look this stuff up. So this whole thing ties into the fractional reserve banking, right?
Yeah, and the fractional reserve banking is a practice that I think if you're going to get rid of a central bank, you have to get rid of this as well. If you want to put the last nail in the coffin, or at least stem the tide for quite some time. Because let's not forget, Andrew Jackson did not do this, even though he did kill the bank. It took them 77 years to regain their power.
Yeah.
If you got rid of the bank and got rid of fractional reserve banking, then man, I'm not sure how long that tide would be stemmed. But it would be quite longer than 77 years, I hope.
So what exactly is fractional reserve banking? It sounds complicated.
It's not really complicated at all, to be quite honest. It's pretty simple on its face, at least. So fractional reserve banking refers to basically the type of banking. It's a standard banking practice nowadays, at the very least, and it's been for quite some time, of issuing more money than the bank holds in reserves. So basically, say for instance, if a bank has, I don't know, $100 in reserve, it can loan out 10 times as much as it has on reserves. So basically, however many reserves the bank has, well, let's just put it as simple as we basically can. Say you have $1 in reserve. Well, if you have $1 in reserve as a bank, you can actually loan out $10 as loans.
How is that possible? That money doesn't actually exist.
Well, it doesn't exist. You're creating it out of nothing.
Basically, what you're telling me is they create money out of nothing. So an example of that might be, if I go to buy a house that costs $100,000, I have to put 20% down. I have to put real money down of $20,000, and they're loaning me $80,000 of money that doesn't actually exist, but they get to collect interest on this fake money. Is that sort of how the whole system works?
Oh, absolutely. The government should have the right to print its own money. Why in the holy hell would you need a private entity full of private stockholders for private profit? Why would you need them to issue you money? You're a government. How is it? You know what I mean?
It doesn't make
any sense at all. How is it that they're more powerful than you?
Right.
No, it doesn't.
I looked a little bit into inflation. If you took $1 in 1913, or something that cost $1 in 1913, today would cost about $26. That's an inflation rate of 2,500%. And another way to look at this numbers is that $1 in 1913 has decreased in value and today is worth about 3 cents. So in other words, the value of the dollar since the creation of the Federal Reserve has been completely wiped out. It's almost worthless. So let me say that again in case it didn't quite sink in. $1 in 1913 has lost 97% of its value from then to today. It's just incredible.
Yeah.
Well, when I researched this, I can only come to one conclusion: is that they won. They won. That's it. I think the game was over a long time ago, and now we're just living in their world. You know,
Yeah, for the moment,
the world they wanted when they planned all this stuff out, that's the world we're living in today. And the crazy thing to me is that it's been going on so long. It's like part of our culture now. Like people can't imagine an economy or a country without a central bank. That's just the way it is. And it reminds me of a short story. It reminds me of a short story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery, about this village. And every year they choose somebody and they execute that person. It's a famous story. You can look it up and it's probably read it online.
I know the one you're referencing.
But they just do it because it's tradition. And that's kind of where we're at with the central banks. It's just, we don't even know why anymore. That's just how it is. We don't even understand how it works. We don't know why we do it. That's just what we do. And that's just reminded me of that story.
But you know what, though? I am kind of inspired, though, because as of recent, it seems like there are a lot more people that are willing to be informed or are trying to be informed.
Yeah.
I mean, we have so many damn distractions nowadays, even just in like culture, entertainment. Damn, there's so many things to pay attention to and to be distracted by. But I do believe that there is a hunger for truth. There is a hunger to know exactly why we have arrived at the spot we are in right now. You know, there's more people that are willing to gain a perspective where this kind of information relates to them directly. I mean, but what I mean by saying that is they're more open to accept this information. In years past, you know, like in the 90s, for example, I remember, you know, being younger in the 90s and every once in a while touching on subjects like this. And the response generally was, well, where's your tinfoil hat? You know,
right,
even like in the 2000s and such. And I'm sure even still now to this day, there's still a lot of sentiment, a lot of reaction like that, you know, but there's a hell of a lot more people that are genuinely interested in this type of history, you know. And I think that there's a lot more people that are open to this, and I think that's due directly to the access of information that we have. You know, there's a lot of there's a lot of misinformation out there too, though. So obviously you got to vet your sources. You really got to pay attention to where this information is coming from, because there's all kinds of just complete lies out there too. You know.
Anything else to add before we wrap it up, Agent ETA?
Well, there's too many other things to add to it. But we got to stop it somewhere. You know,
yeah. All right. Well, let's call it. So thanks for listening. Tune in next time for a topic that we haven't chosen yet.